Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of becoming a police officer, but standing in the academy training facility on her first day, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing only 125 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who could handle dangerous criminals on the streets. The other recruits towered over her, their muscular frames making her feel like a child among giants. When Sergeant Thompson called out names for partner assignments, the groans were audible when her name was paired with the more experienced trainees for sparring exercises. "Great, I got the lightweight," muttered Officer Kane, a 6'2" former Marine with arms like tree trunks. His comment drew snickers from the group, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had worked 2 jobs to pay for the academy, spending countless hours studying law enforcement procedures and physical training techniques, but none of that seemed to matter when faced with the reality of her physical limitations. During the first week of combat training, Sarah was repeatedly thrown to the mat, her attempts at defensive maneuvers easily overpowered by her larger classmates. The instructors shook their heads in disappointment, and she could see the doubt in their eyes. Some even suggested she might be better suited for desk duty or community outreach programs rather than active patrol work. The breaking point came during a simulated arrest scenario. Sarah was tasked with subduing a suspect played by Officer Reynolds, a former wrestler who outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds. Within seconds, she found herself pinned to the ground, unable to move despite all her training. The room erupted in laughter, and she heard someone whisper, "She'll never make it on the streets." That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, staring at her academy handbook and questioning everything. Her father had been a respected officer for 30 years before retiring, and he had always encouraged her to follow her dreams. But the reality of police work seemed so different from what she had imagined. The physical demands were overwhelming, and the constant mockery from her peers was wearing her down mentally and emotionally. She picked up her phone to call her father, ready to tell him she was quitting. But as she scrolled through her contacts, she noticed a text message from her younger sister. "Saw your academy photo on Mom's fridge. So proud of you, sis. You're going to save so many people." The simple message stopped her cold, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place. Sarah had grown up in a rough neighborhood where crime was a daily reality. She had seen too many victims who felt helpless and forgotten by the system. Her dream wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest officer. It was about making a difference in people's lives, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. The next morning, she arrived at the academy 2 hours early and found the training gym empty. She spent the extra time studying the defensive techniques she had struggled with, practicing the movements slowly and methodically. Sarah realized that she couldn't rely on brute strength like her male counterparts, so she would have to be smarter, faster, and more strategic in her approach. She began researching martial arts techniques specifically designed for smaller individuals to overcome larger opponents. Sarah discovered that leverage, timing, and precision could be far more effective than raw power when applied correctly. She started watching videos of female officers who had successfully handled dangerous situations, taking notes on their techniques and tactics. During lunch breaks, while other recruits socialized or rested, Sarah could be found in the library studying case files and tactical manuals. She memorized hand-to-hand combat procedures, learned about pressure points and joint manipulation techniques, and studied the psychological aspects of confrontation management. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed by everyone. Officer Maria Santos, one of the few female instructors at the academy, approached Sarah after a particularly difficult training session. "I see you staying late every day," Santos said. "Most people would have given up by now." Sarah looked up from the manual she was reading, surprised by the comment. "I can't give up," she replied simply. "Too many people are counting on officers to protect them. If I quit because it's hard, what does that say about my commitment to serve?" Santos smiled, recognizing something special in the young recruit's determination. "You remind me of myself when I started," she said. "The academy is designed to weed out those who don't belong, but sometimes it also tries to break those who do. Don't let them break you." That conversation became a turning point for Sarah. She realized that the mockery and doubt from her peers were just obstacles to overcome, not reasons to quit. Every snide comment and dismissive look only fueled her determination to prove that heart and intelligence could triumph over size and strength. As the weeks passed, Sarah's performance began to improve gradually. She was still being overpowered in direct confrontations, but she started using unconventional techniques that caught her opponents off guard. Instead of trying to match their strength, she focused on redirecting their energy and using their momentum against them. The other recruits still laughed and made jokes, but Sarah noticed that some of the instructors were beginning to pay closer attention to her progress. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but there was something different about her approach that set her apart from the others. Her real test was still coming, though. The Academy's final evaluation would include scenarios designed to push every recruit to their absolute limits. Sarah knew that this would be her chance to prove that she belonged among the ranks of police officers, regardless of what anyone else thought about her size or capabilities. Little did she know that her true test wouldn't come in a controlled academy environment, but on the dangerous streets where real lives hung in the balance, and where 5 seasoned officers would soon learn that they had seriously underestimated the rookie they had mocked for so long. 6 months after graduating from the academy, Sarah found herself assigned to the downtown precinct, one of the busiest and most challenging districts in the city. Her supervising officer was Lieutenant Derek Harrison, a 20-year veteran known for his no-nonsense approach and skeptical attitude toward new recruits, especially those he considered physically inadequate for street work. On her first day, Harrison looked her up and down with obvious disappointment. "So you're the rookie they stuck me with," he said, shaking his head. "I specifically requested someone with experience, and they send me someone who looks like she should be checking IDs at a nightclub." Sarah tried to maintain her composure despite the insulting introduction. "Sir, I graduated top of my class in academics and scored high in tactical training," she replied professionally. Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Academic scores don't mean much when you're facing down a 200-pound drug dealer with a knife, Martinez. Out here, size matters, and you don't have it." The first few weeks on patrol proved to be exactly as difficult as Harrison had predicted. Sarah was assigned the most mundane tasks: writing traffic tickets, handling minor disputes, and taking reports for petty crimes. Whenever a potentially dangerous call came in, Harrison would either handle it himself or request backup, making it clear that he didn't trust her to handle anything serious. The other officers in the precinct adopted similar attitudes. Detective Mike Foster, a former football player with a reputation for aggressive tactics, made a point of commenting on Sarah's size whenever she walked by. "Hey, Martinez, did you lose your way to the mall?" became his standard greeting, always accompanied by laughter from his colleagues. Officers Johnson, Reeves, and Patterson formed a tight clique that had worked together for years, and they made no effort to hide their disdain for what they saw as affirmative action hearing. "The department's going soft," Johnson would say loudly whenever Sarah entered the break room. "Pretty soon they'll be hearing high school kids to carry badges." The constant harassment took its toll, but Sarah remained focused on her job. She studied every case file she could access, memorized the department's procedures manual, and spent her off-duty hours learning about the neighborhood she patrolled. While her colleagues saw her attention to detail as obsessive, Sarah understood that knowledge could be the equalizer she needed. Her opportunity to prove herself came on a cold Tuesday evening in November. The precinct received a domestic disturbance call from an apartment complex known for drug activity and violent crime. The caller, a neighbor, reported screaming and what sounded like furniture being thrown around in apartment 4B. Harrison was in the middle of paperwork when the call came in, and Sarah was the only officer immediately available to respond. "Take Martinez," the dispatcher suggested when Harrison hesitated. "Are you kidding me?" Harrison replied over the radio. "This sounds like it could get physical. I'll wait for Foster or Johnson to get back from their call." But the caller phoned again, this time reporting that the screaming had stopped and they were worried someone might be seriously hurt. The silence was actually more concerning than the noise had been, and protocol required an immediate response. Sarah grabbed her radio and headed for her patrol car. "I'm responding to the domestic disturbance on Pine Street," she announced. "ETA 3 minutes." Harrison caught up with her as she was getting into her vehicle. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "You wait for backup, that's an order." "Sir, someone could be seriously injured while we wait," Sarah replied. "I'm trained for this, and protocol says we respond immediately to potential life-threatening situations." Harrison looked at her with frustration and concern. Despite his doubts about her abilities, he genuinely didn't want to see a young officer get hurt on his watch. "Fine, but you wait for me to get there before you go in. Do not engage alone under any circumstances." Sarah nodded and drove to the apartment complex. But when she arrived, she could hear shouting and what sounded like someone being slammed against a wall. A woman was screaming for help, and Sarah knew that waiting for backup could mean the difference between life and death for the victim. She approached the apartment door and could hear a man's voice threatening to kill someone. Through the thin walls, she could make out a woman pleading for her life. Sarah tried to call Harrison for an update on his arrival time, but her radio was getting interference from the building's location near several cell towers. The screaming suddenly stopped again, and Sarah heard what sounded like a body hitting the floor. Making a split-second decision, she drew her weapon and identified herself as police, demanding that the door be opened immediately. The response was immediate and violent. The door flew open, revealing a massive man covered in blood, holding a kitchen knife. Behind him, Sarah could see a woman on the floor, motionless and bleeding from her head. "Drop the weapon," Sarah shouted, but the man charged toward her instead, his eyes wild with rage and what she suspected was drug-induced paranoia. In the academy, this scenario had been practiced dozens of times with professional actors and safety equipment. But facing a real attacker with lethal intent was completely different. The man was at least 6.5 feet tall and probably weighed twice as much as Sarah, but her training kicked in automatically. Instead of trying to physically overpower him, Sarah used his charging momentum against him. As he lunged with the knife, she sidestepped at the last possible moment and used a joint manipulation technique she had practiced countless hours. The man's own forward motion, combined with Sarah's precise application of leverage, sent him crashing into the wall behind her. The impact stunned him temporarily, but he quickly recovered and swung the knife in a wide arc towards Sarah's neck. She ducked under the blade and struck a pressure point on his wrist that caused him to drop the weapon. Before he could react, she had his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that used his size against him. The larger he was, the more painful the position became. Within seconds, Sarah had the handcuffs on him, though he continued struggling violently. She quickly checked on the victim, who was unconscious but breathing. Sarah called for an ambulance and additional units, then secured the scene while keeping the massive suspect under control. When Harrison arrived 5 minutes later, expecting to find Sarah overwhelmed or worse, he was shocked to see her calmly standing over a handcuffed suspect while administering first aid to the victim. The woman survived thanks to Sarah's quick response and proper medical training. Word of the incident spread through the precinct quickly, but instead of earning respect, Sarah found herself facing even more skepticism. "She got lucky," Foster said dismissively. "Next time she might not be so fortunate." Johnson added his own analysis. The guy was probably high and not thinking straight. Against a sober opponent, she wouldn't stand a chance. Even Harrison, despite witnessing Sarah's competent handling of the situation, remained doubtful. "You did okay, Martinez, but you took a huge risk going in alone. What if there had been multiple suspects? What if he had been armed with more than just a knife?" Sarah accepted the criticism without defending herself, knowing that actions would speak louder than words. But deep down, she knew that one successful incident wouldn't be enough to change anyone's mind about her capabilities. She would need something more dramatic to prove that size and strength weren't the only qualities that mattered in police work. That opportunity would come sooner than she expected, in a situation so dangerous and complex that even the most experienced officers would struggle to handle it successfully. 3 weeks after the domestic violence incident, Sarah had returned to her routine of handling minor cases while her colleagues took on the more serious calls. The other officers continued their pattern of jokes and dismissive comments, treating her successful arrest as a fluke rather than evidence of her capabilities. Detective Foster had taken to calling her Lucky Martinez, and the nickname stuck among the others. Even Lieutenant Harrison, despite having witnessed her competence firsthand, remained cautious about assigning her to anything he considered potentially dangerous. The precinct's atmosphere was typical for a Friday evening shift change when everything changed dramatically. At exactly 7:15 p.m., an emergency call came in that would test every officer in the building and ultimately prove that experience and size meant nothing when faced with the right opponent under the right circumstances. The call started as a routine burglary report from Westside Industrial Park, a sprawling complex of warehouses and manufacturing facilities that was usually quiet after business hours. A security guard reported seeing suspicious activity near Building C, which housed a pharmaceutical distribution company. Harrison took the call personally, deciding it was a good opportunity for a quick arrest that could end the week on a positive note. He chose to bring Foster, Johnson, Reeves, and Patterson, the same group that regularly mocked Sarah's abilities. 5 experienced officers for 1 burglar, Foster joked as they prepared to leave. This should be over before it starts. Sarah was completing paperwork at her desk when she overheard their radio chatter. Suspects appear to be heavily armed, Harrison's voice crackled over the speaker. We're going in to assess the situation. What the 5 officers discovered was far from a simple burglary. The pharmaceutical warehouse had been targeted by a sophisticated criminal organization seeking to steal prescription drugs worth millions on the street market. The burglars were actually a team of professional thieves with military training, advanced weapons, and detailed knowledge of police response procedures. As Harrison's team approached the building, they walked directly into a carefully planned ambush. The criminals had positioned themselves strategically throughout the warehouse complex, turning the industrial maze into a deadly trap. Within minutes, all 5 officers were pinned down by automatic weapon fire, completely cut off from backup and unable to retreat. Officer down, Harrison's desperate voice echoed through the precinct radio system. We need immediate backup at Westside Industrial Park. Multiple armed suspects with automatic weapons. We are trapped and taking heavy fire. The precinct erupted into controlled chaos as officers scrambled to respond to the emergency. Sarah jumped up from her desk, reaching for her gear, but Sergeant Williams grabbed her arm. Not you, Martinez. This is way too dangerous. We're calling in SWAT and the tactical response team. Sir, those are my fellow officers in trouble, Sarah protested. I took an oath to protect and serve, and that includes protecting other officers. Williams shook his head firmly. I'm not sending a rookie into a war zone. SWAT is 30 minutes out, and we've got units responding from 3 other precincts. You stay here and coordinate communications. But as more radio calls came in, the situation became increasingly desperate. The criminals had not only trapped Harrison's team, but had also set up roadblocks and explosive devices to prevent other units from reaching the warehouse. The initial backup officers found themselves under fire before they could even get close to the building. They've got the whole complex locked down, reported Sergeant Martinez from one of the blocked units. Professional operation with military-grade equipment. These aren't street criminals, this is organized and well-planned. Sarah listened to the radio chatter with growing alarm. Her colleagues were trapped in a deadly situation, and the standard response procedures weren't working. The criminals had obviously studied police tactics and prepared countermeasures for every conventional approach. While the supervisors debated strategy and waited for specialized units, Sarah studied the building schematics that had been pulled up on the computer system. The pharmaceutical warehouse was part of a connected complex with underground utility tunnels and service corridors that wouldn't appear on any tactical maps the criminals might have obtained. Sarah had patrolled this area extensively during her first weeks on the job, often walking through the industrial park during her shifts. She remembered noticing the utility access points and had even helped a maintenance worker who had gotten locked out of one of the service tunnels. Her attention to detail and methodical approach to learning her patrol area had given her knowledge that none of the more experienced officers possessed. More urgent radio calls interrupted her thoughts. Harrison's down. Foster's voice was filled with panic. He's been hit and he's bleeding badly. We can't get to him. They've got us completely surrounded. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah realized that conventional backup might arrive too late to save her colleagues. SWAT was still 20 minutes away, and the other units couldn't penetrate the criminals' defensive positions. Making a decision that would define her career, Sarah quietly gathered her gear and slipped out of the precinct through a side exit. She drove to the industrial park using back roads that avoided the main approaches where other officers were pinned down. Sarah parked several blocks away and approached the complex on foot, using her detailed knowledge of the area to access the utility tunnel system. The tunnels were narrow, dark, and cramped, but they provided a way to move through the complex without being detected by the criminals who were focused on defending against conventional assault tactics. As she crawled through the service corridors, Sarah could hear gunfire and shouting above her. She used the building's fire safety maps, which she had memorized during her patrol duties, to navigate toward the warehouse where her colleagues were trapped. The tunnel system brought her up inside the building, emerging through a maintenance access panel in the warehouse's break room. Sarah found herself behind the criminals' positions, with a clear view of their tactical setup and her fellow officers' desperate situation. Harrison was indeed wounded, lying motionless behind a forklift while the other 4 officers were spread out behind various pieces of equipment, unable to move or help their fallen lieutenant. The criminals had positioned themselves with professional precision, covering all the conventional entry and exit points. Sarah realized that her size and unconventional approach had given her the one advantage that mattered in this situation: the element of surprise. The criminals had prepared for every standard police tactic, but they hadn't anticipated a single officer infiltrating their position through routes they didn't know existed. What happened next would become legend in the precinct, a story that would be told and retold for years to come, and proof that courage, intelligence, and determination could triumph over size, experience, and conventional thinking when lives hung in the balance. Sarah crouched in the maintenance room, her heart pounding as she assessed the tactical situation through the small window in the door. The warehouse was like a battlefield, with her 5 colleagues pinned down behind industrial equipment, while 6 heavily armed criminals maintained strategic positions throughout the facility. The criminals were clearly professionals, using hand signals and coordinated movements that indicated military or special operations training. They had automatic rifles, tactical gear, and had set up their positions to create overlapping fields of fire that made any conventional rescue attempt virtually impossible. Harrison lay motionless behind an overturned forklift about 30 feet from Sarah's position. She could see blood pooling around him, and from his shallow breathing, she knew he was losing consciousness fast. Foster was behind a stack of shipping pallets to the right, while Johnson, Reeves, and Patterson were spread out behind various pieces of equipment, all of them effectively trapped. The lead criminal, a tall man with a military-style haircut, was coordinating the defense from a position near the main entrance. He spoke into a radio headset, updating someone outside about the police response. "Phase 2 is holding," he reported. "Local units neutralized, specialized response still 15 minutes out. Continue with the extraction." Sarah realized that this wasn't just about stealing drugs. The criminals were using the trapped officers as a diversion while they completed their real operation elsewhere in the complex. Every minute that passed gave them more time to accomplish their primary objective and escape. She studied the layout carefully, noting that the criminals' positions were designed to repel frontal assault, but left them vulnerable to attack from unexpected angles. Their confidence in their tactical superiority had created blind spots that a smaller, more agile opponent could exploit. Sarah began moving through the warehouse's network of maintenance corridors and storage areas, using her knowledge of the building's layout to position herself behind the first criminal. He was focused on keeping Foster pinned down and didn't notice the slight sound of the ventilation grate being carefully removed behind him. The takedown had to be absolutely silent to avoid alerting the others. Sarah emerged from the vent system directly above the criminal's position and dropped down behind him with precise timing. Using a sleeper hold technique she had practiced countless times in training, she rendered him unconscious in seconds without making any noise that would alert his companions. Sarah quickly secured his weapons and radio equipment, then used his tactical vest and helmet to disguise her appearance. In the dim warehouse lighting and from a distance, she would hopefully be mistaken for one of the criminals by their teammates. Moving to the second position required crossing an open area where she would be visible to at least 2 other criminals. Sarah used the captured radio to create confusion, mimicking the unconscious criminal's voice to report a false sighting of police movement on the building's far side. "Target 1 to command," she whispered into the radio, disguising her voice with the criminal's gruff tone. "Movement spotted near the loading dock, 2 officers attempting to flank from the east side." The ruse worked perfectly. 2 criminals immediately moved toward the reported threat, leaving the remaining positions less defended. Sarah used their distraction to approach the second criminal, who was focused on his new assignment and completely unaware of the threat behind him. This takedown required more creativity. The criminal was positioned where a direct approach would be visible to his teammates, so Sarah used a distraction technique. She threw a small piece of metal equipment across the warehouse, creating a noise that drew the criminal's attention away from his assigned zone. When he turned to investigate the sound, Sarah was already moving. She struck pressure points that temporarily paralyzed his trigger finger, then used his momentary confusion to disarm him and apply a chokehold that left him unconscious within seconds. 2 down, 4 to go, but the next positions were more challenging. The remaining criminals were closer together and had better sight lines, making stealth approaches nearly impossible. Sarah needed a new strategy that would use their training and expectations against them. She noticed that the criminals were using standard military tactical formations, which meant they would respond to certain situations in predictable ways. Sarah decided to create chaos that would force them to abandon their defensive positions and react to multiple perceived threats. Using the captured radio equipment, Sarah began broadcasting false reports that suggested a full SWAT team assault was beginning from multiple directions. She changed her voice and radio frequency to simulate different units, reporting various tactical movements around the building. Alpha team in position on north side, she reported, then switched frequencies. Bravo team moving to east entrance. Sniper teams report visual confirmation of targets. The psychological warfare worked exactly as planned. The remaining criminals began to panic as they tried to respond to what appeared to be a coordinated assault by specialized units. Their disciplined formation broke down as they tried to reposition themselves to address multiple threats that didn't actually exist. In the confusion, Sarah was able to approach the third criminal, who had moved from his original position to counter the reported sniper threat. She used his momentary distraction to strike nerve points that temporarily disabled his ability to grip his weapon, then applied a joint lock that forced him to the ground silently. The leader and his remaining partner finally realized something was wrong when 3 of their team stopped responding to radio calls. But by then, Sarah had positioned herself where she could observe both remaining criminals while staying hidden behind industrial equipment. "Something's not right," the leader said to his partner. "Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot aren't responding. Check their positions." As the 4th criminal moved to investigate his missing teammates, Sarah saw her opportunity. She had studied the warehouse layout carefully and knew that his route would take him past a section of elevated storage where she could position herself for an ambush. Sarah climbed quickly and quietly to the elevated position, timing her movement to coincide with the criminal's approach. When he passed directly below her, she dropped down behind him and applied a rear chokehold that rendered him unconscious before he could alert his leader. Now only the leader remained, but he was the most dangerous of the group, clearly the most experienced and heavily armed. He had taken a defensive position that gave him excellent sight lines to all approaches, and he was becoming increasingly suspicious about his team's disappearance. Sarah realized that a direct confrontation with the leader would be extremely dangerous, especially since he was now alert and expecting trouble. She needed to find a way to neutralize him without giving him a chance to harm the trapped officers or escape. The solution came from an unexpected source, Lieutenant Harrison, who had regained consciousness and was trying to signal something to her. Despite his wounds and weakened condition, he had been watching Sarah's systematic takedown of the criminals and understood what she was attempting to do. Harrison managed to create a small distraction by deliberately making noise behind his cover, drawing the leader's attention away from Sarah's position. It was exactly the opportunity she needed for her final approach, and the wounded lieutenant's contribution would prove crucial to the success of her impossible rescue mission. When Harrison deliberately scraped his boot against the concrete floor, the leader immediately swung his automatic rifle toward the sound, giving Sarah the split-second opening she needed. She had positioned herself on a catwalk above his location, and his attention was now focused entirely on what he perceived as a threat from Harrison's direction. Sarah dropped silently from the catwalk, landing directly behind the leader. But this final confrontation would be different from the others. The criminal leader was more alert, better trained, and heavily armed with a weapon that could kill multiple officers if he managed to use it. The takedown had to be perfect on the first attempt. Sarah used a combination of techniques she had learned in training and refined through countless hours of practice. She struck the pressure point on his wrist that controlled his grip strength while simultaneously applying leverage to his elbow joint that forced him to drop the rifle. The leader spun around, reaching for a sidearm, but Sarah was already inside his defensive perimeter. She used his larger size against him, redirecting his momentum and applying a joint manipulation technique that sent him crashing to the warehouse floor. Within seconds, she had him in a submission hold that made any movement painful and potentially dangerous to his own joints. "Officer Martinez, DCPD," she called out as she secured the handcuffs. "All suspects neutralized. I need immediate medical assistance for Lieutenant Harrison." The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of her colleagues emerging from their positions, staring in complete disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Foster, Johnson, Reeves, and Patterson looked around at the 6 unconscious criminals, then at the small rookie officer who had somehow accomplished what their combined years of experience couldn't achieve. "How the hell did you?" Foster started to say, but trailed off as he looked at the systematic way Sarah had taken down each criminal position. Sarah was already moving toward Harrison, applying pressure to his wounds and radioing for paramedics. "Lieutenant needs immediate medical attention," she reported. "Gunshot wound to the shoulder, possible blood loss, but conscious and stable." Harrison looked up at her with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "Martinez," he said weakly, "remind me never to doubt you again." When SWAT finally arrived, expecting to find a dangerous hostage situation, they instead discovered 5 rescued officers and 6 subdued criminals secured with professional precision. The SWAT commander, Captain Rodriguez, had seen many tactical operations in his career, but nothing quite like this. "One officer took down all 6 suspects," he asked Harrison as the paramedics worked on his injuries. Harrison nodded, still somewhat stunned by what he had witnessed. "She came through some kind of tunnel system, took them out one by one without any of them realizing what was happening. It was like watching a ghost work." The story spread through the police department with incredible speed. By the next morning, officers from precincts across the city were calling to verify the details. Sarah Martinez, the rookie who had been mocked for her size and inexperience, had accomplished something that would have challenged even the most elite tactical units. Detective Foster was the first to approach her when she returned to the precinct after giving her statement to Internal Affairs. "Martinez," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed, "I owe you an apology. We all do. What you did last night. I've never seen anything like it." Johnson, Reeves, and Patterson followed with similar acknowledgments. The jokes and dismissive comments stopped completely, replaced by genuine respect and curiosity about how she had developed such extraordinary tactical skills. But Sarah's response surprised them all. "I didn't do anything special," she said simply. "I just used my training and paid attention to details that others might have overlooked. Size and strength matter in police work, but they're not the only things that matter." Captain Martinez called Sarah into his office the following week, with several department officials present. "Officer Martinez," he began formally, "your actions at Westside Industrial Park demonstrated exceptional courage, tactical thinking, and professional competence. You saved the lives of 5 fellow officers and prevented the escape of a dangerous criminal organization." Sarah listened quietly as the captain continued. "I'm recommending you for the department's Medal of Valor, and I'm also offering you the opportunity to apply for our tactical response unit. Your unconventional approach and ability to think outside standard procedures could be valuable assets for specialized operations." The offer to join the tactical unit was tempting, but Sarah politely declined. "Thank you, sir, but I prefer patrol work. I became a police officer to help people in my community, and I think I can do the most good on the streets where I can interact with citizens every day." Her decision earned even more respect from her colleagues, who realized that Sarah's motivations were genuinely about service rather than personal advancement or recognition. Lieutenant Harrison returned to duty 6 weeks later, and his first official act was to request that Sarah be assigned as his permanent partner. "I've been a cop for 20 years, he told the captain, "and I've never worked with anyone who combines intelligence, courage, and dedication the way she does." The dynamic in the precinct changed completely after that night. Sarah was no longer seen as the weak rookie who needed protection. but as a competent professional whose unique skills and perspective made everyone around her better at their jobs. Foster began asking her advice on cases involving smaller suspects who might try to use their size to escape conventional tactics. Johnson started studying the same tactical manuals that Sarah had used to develop her techniques. Reeves and Patterson began paying more attention to building layouts and environmental factors that could influence tactical situations. Sarah's influence extended beyond just her immediate colleagues. The story of her rescue at Westside Industrial Park became a case study at the police academy, used to teach recruits about the importance of adaptability, attention to detail, and creative problem-solving in law enforcement. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the department viewed diversity and non-traditional approaches to police work. Sarah had proven that effectiveness as a police officer couldn't be measured solely by physical attributes or conformity to established patterns. Years later, when Sarah had become a decorated detective with numerous commendations for her innovative approaches to complex cases, new recruits would ask her about that legendary night at the warehouse. Her answer was always the same. Police work isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being smart, dedicated, and willing to do whatever it takes to protect people who can't protect themselves. The 5 officers who had once mocked her became her strongest supporters, and their transformation from skeptics to allies demonstrated that even experienced professionals could learn and grow when confronted with evidence that challenged their assumptions. Sarah Martinez had proven that heroism comes in all sizes, and that the heart of a true police officer beats just as strongly in a 5'4" rookie as it does in the most imposing veteran. Her story became an inspiration not just for other small-statured officers, but for anyone who had ever been told they weren't big enough, strong enough, or experienced enough to achieve their dreams. The warehouse incident marked the beginning of a distinguished career that would include many more acts of courage and innovation. But it would always be remembered as the night when 5 officers learned never to underestimate the rookie they had once dismissed as too small to matter.